The topic I am going to discuss is Bertrand Russell's theory of knowledge. So, for 40, 50 years, Bertrand Russell had a huge, there's a huge literature which Bertrand Russell has written. And there is not only primary literature, there is also a secondary literature which is associated with how Bertrand Russell, people who have written about Bertrand Russell, and the people who Bertrand Russell responded. So to what I should say, locate him in the Russellian tradition. To locate, it's better to find him primarily. I will say rather the virtually every stand of the developments in a particular scholar. Broadly, I would say he could belong to the school of analytical philosophy, and virtually every strand of development either originated with him or was transformed by him by being transmitted through him. So that would be a better characterization. Maybe analytical philosophy owes more to Bertrand Russell than any other philosopher. So so how his understanding of knowledge, the characterization of knowledge by Bertrand Russell, which spanned more than which spanned a huge time. So he would rather, unlike his maybe rationalistic predecessors who started with grand metaphysical principles and worked downwards, or unlike his empirical predecessors who started with deliverances of sense experiences and worked up, Russell began his investigation in the middle. Maybe he was the most energetic propagandist, you can say, uh, of his school. In his earlier stages, maybe that was mellowed down later. His his particular way of saying things, but he wanted to somehow take things to the abstract of things and then to work them in some concrete way and to have some a middle point where he could somehow see both of them or somehow have an amicable way of appreciating both of these approaches, theoretical as well as practical approaches. So Russell's version is maybe traditionally a form of foundationalism. So ultimately all our beliefs are ultimately based on some basic foundational beliefs which are beyond doubt. And when I say beyond doubt, I would particularly want to locate Russell in the time that maybe uh, before I'm going to. So wanted to, before I'm going to say what his attitude towards knowledge was, I would famously quote his two statements from two different one points he has written. So that it's that how come it is that human beings whose tryst with the world is so brief, personal, limited, can nevertheless be able to know how much they are knowing. So this is one thing. And what we mean by knowledge is not as much definite or unambiguous answer as much as we answer this question: what is boldness? So in the first his or the another statement, for example, in his earlier stages, the aim of philosophy was to make a self-consistent whole of the various sciences. So at the one end of the careers, there it should be synthesis of four sciences like physics, physiology, psychology, and mathematical logic. So Russell's respect for science helped him foster a viewpoint. He was positivist, but Russell was sympathetic to positive. So, so what I would rather say with these two statements, looking something at wonder, how is that human beings are able to know, and if whatever they know, so how can we मतलब, even characterize, or how can we define vaguely how do we know what we know? So can it be characterized or categorized in a certain way which is not very vague or which is not very subjective? So he had these two very things broadly. So coupled with the fact, if you read his certain statements in My Mental Development, so his Russell in his earlier years wanted has had some developed some the traditional religion he could not associate it with it, but somehow the certitude which was entailed when a person believes in a certain religion so he always had craving for that certitude. So the sort of certitude which religious people have there in their fundamental beliefs, since he had departed from the traditional way of looking at things, so his that certitude he wanted to find where he could find it. So he tried to find it near his earlier stages in mathematics, which was later somehow partially shattered by the criticism of Wittgenstein and later developments in mathematics, which I'll just later come to. So his earlier appreciation of mathematics, finding the certitude or certainty of a religious belief in mathematics. That was one of the important way of looking at how he constructed knowledge paradigm as such. And the way mathematical understanding of things when he tried to apply it to sciences, linguistics, philosophy, mathematics, and his epistemology, ontology. So his you can see so the basic method, the mathematical method in his earlier stage, mathematico-logical method, how he arrived at it. First, I will try to see how he arrived at mathematical-logical method. So you have to understand the times in which he was living in was basically he was on the one side influenced by the empiric tradition of Hume and Mill, but on the other hand there was the influence of Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, had been very much prevalent at that time. So Kant was not entirely empiricist. He had some. So the Kantian tradition and the empirical tradition of Hume, somehow Russell, the analytical tradition of Russell can be traced. The analytical tradition of mathematics, the logical mathematical method, can be partially in a good level traced to these two schools. For example, in Kant, famously in his Prolegomena in metaphysics, he wanted to address the question: how is mathematics possible? How is pure science possible? How is metaphysics possible? How is knowledge possible? So he wanted to address those questions. So one good thing in the he one thing he arrived was that something called analysis and synthetic analytical truths and synthetic and analytical statement and synthetic statement. So analytical statement is a statement where you can single predicate can be only a single a subject and the relation of subject and predicate. A predicate can be traced to a single premise. So we can say in analytical statement you can always trace the reality of things or statements to a single reality at foundationally. While in case of synthetic judgments or synthetic statements, you can always add something to analytical statements, which will also explain the things, whether empirically or whether linguistically, or you can trace it to not one statement but many other statements. And those single statements maybe they may be rooted in experiences or not. So here comes the debate of what is a priori and what is priori truth, and so how where do we place human experience to, and how do we characterize general knowledge as such, the prioriness and the a prioriness of the things or statements or realities of not only statements, experiences, and whether intuitive experience is a priori or not, or can we place intuitive experience, intuitive truths, are they experiential or prior to experience? So these were sort of debates which we are going on in the Kantian tradition. And simultaneously, the according to Hume and this thing, so somehow Hume was emphasis to the core, in the sense that he wanted to deny, he wanted to locate experience as the primacy of knowledge, and experience is something we experience in terms of senses and logic. So with this background, Russell was very much influenced by these debates which were going on, and somehow he could analyze, or he could place, wanted to find his he wanted to find that certitude which religious people have according to some fundamental realities in a tradition, which he in his earlier stages, if you have to construct, if you have basically trying to construct how Russell perceived knowledge, so how his analytical logical logical mathematical method, so we are interested, that was basically the debates which were going on. So in that background, we can place the work of Frege. Frege was a mathematician who wanted to somehow mm, the truths of arithmetic, he could logicize them. He could trace the truths of arithmetic can be explained by logical methods. And somehow the Frege method, and if the truths of this can be traced to logic. So what Bertrand Russell became more Catholic. So he not only wanted to trace the truths of arithmetic, arithmetic logic and arithmetic geometry and algebra to maybe logic. He wanted to reduce the whole uh, truths of arithmetic geometry, the, in terms of whole of mathematics in terms of logic. And in case of geometry, which was which was taken as a part of empirical science, Russell also takes it from the was taken as a subset of empirical science, or it was studied as part of physics. So one important point was that in Kantian tradition, what Kant could see is that he somehow uh, talked of the a priority of the Euclidean geometry, synthetic a priority of the Euclidean geometry. So geometrical statements or truths, even though they were studied as part of empirical philosophy or part of physics, but somehow Kant, in a sophisticated way, try to say that the Euclidean geometry could be, it can have they have an independent origin in the synthetic tradition, and non-Euclidean geometry had not been discovered. What Russell did in his PhD thesis was that he, with his sophisticated arguments, with his arguments from projective geometry, tried to show that the a priority of the synthetic geometry can be extended to non-Euclidean geometry also. So he improvised. His arguments were more sophisticated than Kant in terms of proving the a priority of the non-Euclidean, the synthetic reality of the non-Euclidean geometrical statements. So the physical space, which later Einsteinian general theory of, when we apply non-Euclidean geometry to the Einsteinian general theory of relativity, the studying geometry as a part of physics and taking geometrical non-Euclid geometrically as also more maybe logical constructions, a priori logical constructions, and it so happens that they might apply to the our understanding of the space. So in terms of logical constructions, they are still a priori synthetic logical constructions, the Euclidean and non-Euclidean. So you can say Russell in on one side was influenced by his departure, in certain extent, the departure from Kantian understanding of mathematics, as well as his dissertation on Leibniz, where he, if you read the section of knowledge, so he has very much tried to see Leibniz in the tradition of logic, and he could reduce things, entire things of geometry, algebra, and other things in terms of logic. But somehow Russell would decry, or she will critique in his Leibnizian methodology of constructing logic through analysis is fine, but it's not useful in philosophy as such. Maybe no. So even the Spinoza's taking the way he tried to axiomatize ethics, so he would rather was not maybe happy of reducing this analytical method of logic to other things also. Maybe the his teacher Whitehead, he had written that book Universal Algebra, where he was influenced by George Boole, but he would rather see the role of logic and symbolic logic in reducing the different branches to see it in a unified way. So, how Russell's logical mathematical approach or aptitude was basically influenced by these developments, and he was more, what I should say, his the Frege would want to only reduce arithmetics to logic. So the approach of Russell was to not only reduce arithmetic to logic, but different branch of all branches, mathematics as a whole, to logic. So thus was the start of this analytical logical method. So here, rather, I would add as a statement that in his times there were people like Wittgenstein and Poincare who did not who somehow found some flaws of reducing all of mathematics to logic. So their belief was that the all statements as cannot be mathematical statements cannot be reduced to logic, because the mathematical the understanding of things, they have some truth value, or they have some thing which cannot be condensed in the logical analysis. So they had a different viewpoint than that of Russell. Since we are talking of Russell, so how he constructed knowledge in his earlier stages. So he so his logical so why should, so his if I quote him, Russell, so his logicism, which was called his approach, or so what uh, so Russell was called just the first stage of his philosophical as simply as analysis. So Russell's method of analysis, throughout his career, he held that philosophical analysis proceeds backwards from the body of knowledge to its premises, and it's secondly, it proceeds from premises to a reconstruction of an original body of knowledge. Russell called the first stage of philosophical analysis simply as analysis, and second stage as synthesis, or sometimes constructions. Russell turned his analysis from mathematics and logic to other philosophical concerns such as epistemology, mathematics, philosophy of language, and philosophy of science. So, in all cases, the philosophical analysis was aimed at non empirical intellectual discovery of propositions and concepts from which could be fashioned premises for the basic data from which analysis had begun. So this is what his aim was. So Russell contends that because of the regressive aspects of mathematics, the methodology of mathematics is closely related to the that of ordinary science. So now, so it begins. So the logico-analysis method, analytico-logical method, logico-mathematical method, was then extended to the physical sciences also, physics and other. which I have talked, linguistics and other things, how much it was useful or successful, or how much it could encompass the other realities of the other sciences. So he had something to say it in the later stages. But for example, so what Russell says, we tend to believe that premises because we can see that their consequences are true, instead of believing that consequences because we know premises are true. But inferring of premises from consequences is essence of induction, and this method investigates the principles of mathematics, is really an inductive method and is substantially same as method of discovering general laws of nature in other sciences. So he is saying that the efficacy of the mathematical method of going from general to particular, and if you go from particular to general, you can invert the same thing. So the mathematical method and scientific method at this stage of his understanding of things, he would say that they can be inverted in some loose sense, not exactly, but somehow you can say there was a huge similarity, which later somehow he could say that so there was some problem. The mathematical method and the scientific method, they don't match exactly, or they misappropriate them in certain senses. So Russell allowed both the explicitly both the. Now, what important methodological thing what he Russell found was that so analysis of Russell says leads to premises that are decreasingly self-evident. So the decreasing self-evidence of premises has also a basis of Russell's vintage statement. So what he wanted to say, what when we apply the analytical method, attitude or methodology, what he says is that the point of philosophy is to start with something so simple as not to seem worth stating, and to end up with something as not to seem worth stating, and end up with something so paradoxical so that no one will believe it. So that's what the analytical method is, or normally mathematically. So we start with certain primitive statements which we call axioms, which we say they are so simple, they are so true, which we cannot prove or they cannot be conceptualized. So they are too abstract, and once we are going to work on that system, we might reach something which is startling or paradoxical. So, so he tried to apply the same this analytical method also when he tried to when he wrote the book Analysis of Matter, the applying the deductive mathematical method in terms of scientific empiricism, and how he tried to locate general theory of relativity. So he tried to reconstruct a ontology of matter in some sense. So what he tried to address when he tried to apply the logico-analytical method, mathematical method in physics, is that, for example, so he wanted to address the questions through this method. What is the general structure? What are the relations of space and time, causality and quantitative series, respectively? So, so when I'll just come back to this fact that the logico-analytical method, somehow Russell, with the coming of Principia Mathematica, the famous program of Russell, Whitehead and Russell, I would rather say not Russell and Whitehead, Whitehead and Russell, because Whitehead was primarily a writer of first author, and he even wrote the third volume of the book. But Russell had significant contribution to that very program or approach of reducing all of mathematics to logic, which after Aristotle was considered the great work in logic. So, what after completing that very work, Russell somehow, and there were some essays on denoting, for example, knowledge by truth, knowledge by acquaintances. So, what Russell in his mind wanted was basically to have a grand, um, ambitious project of trying to reduce all of knowledge via this logical method, symbolic logic, to reducing all things to this way. So, which was somehow retarded by the criticism which Wittgenstein and maybe developments, later developments in maybe mathematics, with the discovery of Gaudier, that arithmeticization of logic is not possible mathematically, and the criticism of Wittgenstein, who showed that the mathematical truths are ultimately, you reduce them to logic and language they are tautologies agreed upon linguistic rules. So his earlier belief in the certitude which he tried to find in the mathematical truths was somehow partially shattered. So in the meantime, he was preoccupied. His knowledge project, somehow he was not preeminently occupied. I would say he was occupied with some other projects like analysis of matter, analysis of mind, principles of philosophy, and he, in a way, constructed. He even got influenced by the idea of he was the doctrine of neutral monism. So how you construct mind and how you construct matter, and if there is a mind and matter, what is supreme, what is mind and what is matter. So so what is mind and what is matter? So what is mind and what is matter? In that very thing, he came to the conclusion that mind is less mental and matter should be less material. What he means by that, he wanted to have a middle ground by which he would want to trace the realities of mind and matter by invoking a doctrine of neutral monism, which was influenced also by William James. His particular understanding of scientific, his particular way of looking at things, psychology in terms of empirical way. And so with these developments he wanted to, and his famous essay of relation of sense perception to physics, he would want to, he tried to see the realities of matter, can we trace them to some cognitive aspect of the sense perceptions, or we can reduce the reality of even our mind or mentation in terms of some realization of some materiality, taking matter ultimate. So he somehow tried to bridge the two and try to have a doctrine which will try to somehow make not war but peace with both of these attitudes in somewhat middle. So, but in the meantime he somehow wanted to apply, he, if you study Russell's philosophy back and forth, so he would want to apply this logico analytical method, even though he had not totally lost his faith in it. Somehow he wanted to somehow crisscrossed. He impended his grand project of what is knowledge, meaning of knowledge in the widest term between 1912 and 27. He somehow postponed that question, but immediately he still applied that logico analytical method, and then synthesizing whatever, or reconstructing after the analysis what we understand about things at large, whether the realities may be empirical or realities may be mathematical. So in the meantime he applied those things in the realm of language or linguistics, and there were many statements and papers famously, like how you construct knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. So there were many good essays he has written in his book Logic and Knowledge. So analysis of mind, analysis. So And one good thing about this inquiry into meaning and truth, where he has tried to see it thing. So, what one important doctrine or uh, thing which he arrived at was basically that what I should so so in, so what he got, he arrived at a doctrine called logical atomism. So what logical atomism is, what I should say is that is to bring science into philosophy. Mathematics is based on principles of physics, epistemology, and psychology. It is the later aspect that changes are far-reaching. So, although he retains his commitment to logic, the business of philosophy, as I conceive it, is essentially that of logical analysis followed by logical synthesis. He arrives at it. He has a belief that the business of so this is how he reconstructs knowledge at this stage when he arrived at this doctrine of logical atomism, that the business of philosophy as I conceive it is essentially that of logical analysis followed by logical synthesis. So we can characterize this doctrine in these very sentences. So his interest is not language in logic, but in bringing rest of philosophy into line with science and physics and psychology in particularly. So he's not merely interested in language. He wants to see things in some holistic way, which includes other subjects also, by this doctrine of logical atomism. By this doctrine of logical atomism. And so why he called the reason I call my doctrine why logical atomism is because the atoms that I wish to arrive at are as a sort of lost residue in the analysis are called logical atoms and not physical atoms. Some of them will be particular, such as things as little patches of color or sounds or momentary things. Some of them will be predicates, which may be relevant, and so on. So this is the way he tries to characterize the logical atomism as a doctrine in his larger characterization of knowledge, how he tries to understand knowledge. And in his inquiry into meaning and truth, he says that if our knowledge is to be roughly coexistential with what we all think we know, it must be derived from three sources: principles of logical inferences, beliefs or sentences having a certain kind of relation to the same occurrences, which is in general non linguistic, and third is principle of extra logical inference. So now down I've reached his doctrine of logical atomism. So now I would rather come to his very important doctrine. I would not say doctrine. I would rather say his impending need of trying to had to reconstruct or organize the entire of knowledge in terms of some basic underlying principles, which with having a faith in the logico mathematical method, but trying to apply the same in the domain of how we construe knowledge. So in this thing, he had faith in the empirical understanding of things, but somehow he you can say he was not empiricist. He was empiricist in that sense. So how our understanding of knowledge, which primarily constructs of maybe three components, he was primarily mostly interested in the causation, the inference part of it, the causation, inference, and then the induction part of it. So these three things. So how he so if he in his earlier before I'm going to talk about this thing, I will make a slight digression that Bertrand Russell in his analysis of mind and matter, in the analysis of matter, He has tried to able to, he was interested, he was very much enamored by the events of general theory of relativity. So in general theory of relativity was the way it somehow shifted, it somehow fundamentally the times 1920s, the entire the way we look at physics and how the physics looks about the world, it somehow revolutionized the way people thought of before. So Russell somehow wanted to address that very question in the larger way. He looked at philosophy, mathematics, the mathematical induction, scientific induction, and the deductive empirical generalizations by whether it's a scientific method or mathematical method. So he wanted to locate the general theory of relativity in that very background understanding of his logic, deduction, induction, mathematical induction, and scientific induction. So he was able to construct. So even though the lot of things which he talks of quantum mechanics, they may be obsolete, or if the quantum mechanics as such was developing, so maybe a lot of things or statements may not be, they may be obsolete or they may be out of. But since he was aware, he tried to assimilate a lot of, so you could see a lot of statements by the or contributors of relativity from Eddington to Herman Weyl. So you could see how they see relativity and how he was able to somehow reconstruct. I would not say how he was able to locate relativity in his own epistemological paradigm. And he also introduced some sophistication when he used that compresence. So he introduced some terms like compresence, where, for example, a person is simultaneously seeing, believing, seeing, hearing, or sensing. So these are three sensations, but they are going on in the same very person. But in theory of relativity or special theory of relativity, our characterization of an event, how an observer observes an event, and how three observers, which may be observing the same event, but they may not be intersecting the same events with each other, but they may be observing simultaneity externally, not internally. So he could have this sophisticated doctrine of compresence, where compresence is not mathematically transitive relations. For example, if A is B, B is C, means A is C. So if three persons can have a simultaneity, they can experience simultaneity at a given point, but not with regard to each other. So he had some sophistications in general theory of relativity. So, but the important point is that he was able to reconstruct the ontology of matter and place it in terms of his own episteme and the way he constructed knowledge paradigm as such. So one thing which I would rather say is that which I would rather say is that that he the question, for example, Russell also wanted to address the, when we talk of logic, we have certain amount of brevity in it. So we want to reduce the statements or understanding of things in terms of some minimalism. So this logical, so we want to make statements crisp, precise, and this attitude. So how much when Russell wants to say something, for example, in the epistemological question, why should I believe that the set of why believe in this set of propositions is quite different from the logical question, what is the smallest and the logically simplest group of propositions from which the set of propositions can be deduced. One reason for believing logic and pure mathematics are in part only inductive and probability. And in spite of the fact that in the logical order, the propositions of logic and pure mathematics follow from the premises of logic by pure deduction. I think this point important since errors are liable to arise from assimilating the logical to the epistemological order, and conversely from assimilating epistemological to the logical order. So if he, the difficulty which I was saying, that he was appreciating the, initially he was very much Catholic. He was converted believer that logical mathematical method is antidote or for all things, philosophy, metaphysics, for in general, knowledge in general. But later he found that there may be, when we try to apply the logical analytical method to the epistemological things, when you go both ways, there is some discomfort, which he is trying to articulate.